The water looked calm that morning. That was the thing Gail Mora remembered most, years later, when someone asked him what it felt like before. Not the warmth, not the laughter of his teammates still shouting behind him on the court, not the smell of salt and sunscreen and competition, just the water. How it looked like something you could trust. He was 31 years old and built like a weapon. 6'4", 280 pounds of Georgetown forged defensive tackle who had once drawn interest from 3 NFL franchises before a knee decided otherwise. He had rebuilt himself after that the way he rebuilt everything, quietly, stubbornly, by not accepting that the first answer was the final answer. Now he ran a technology venture and played beach volleyball on weekends and felt, on mornings like this one, like the universe owed him nothing and he owed it nothing back, and they were even, and it was fine. He ran toward the ocean to cool off between sets. He dove. He hit something he did not expect to be there. The sound inside his skull was not a crack. It was more like a door closing, very firmly, on a room he had been living in his entire life. And then the room was gone, and there was only the water. And the water was pressing down on him from every direction, and his arms would not move. His arms would not move. He could hear, distantly, the shouting of the people on the shore. Someone had seen him go in and not come back up the right way. The voices were urgent but muffled, like voices through a wall, and he thought with a strange clarity that they needed to hurry, that the ocean was cold, that he needed to tell them something but could not remember the words. His face was above the surface. He could breathe. He breathed. The sky was exactly the same blue it had always been. That was what he could not reconcile afterward, that the sky had not changed at all. The Vorith ship was called Absolute Verdict. Cale would learn this later, in the hospital, when a translator specialist sat beside his bed and explained in the patient, over-enunciated tones of someone speaking to a person who might not understand that the vessel which had neutralized his unit was a mobile biological suppression platform, that it had been parked in geosynchronous orbit for 11 months before its field generators were deployed at ground level, that the field was invisible, undetectable by any human sensor array, and that it worked by interacting with specific proteins in the human nervous system to interrupt motor signal transmission between the brain and the spine. It was not a weapon, the specialist explained. Not technically. The Vorith did not consider it a weapon. They considered it a courtesy, a non-lethal method of neutralizing human combatants without causing permanent structural damage to what they had already classified in their administrative filings as a contested but ultimately negotiable biological resource. Cale looked at the ceiling for a long time after the specialist left. His hands were on the blanket in front of him. He could see them. They were his hands, the same hands that had put down quarterbacks and built companies and held his wife's face in the dark when she was afraid. They were right there, 8 inches from his eyes, and they would not move. 3 doctors came in on the second day. The senior one had the practiced kindness of someone who had delivered this news many times, and had learned that kindness was better than false hope, but had not yet learned that sometimes false hope is a medical intervention of its own. The prognosis, she said, was poor. The Vorith suppression field had interacted with his C5 and C6 vertebrae in a way that was, she used this word twice, catastrophic. His spinal cord had not been severed. The field did not sever. It compressed. It calcified. It built walls of scar tissue across pathways that used to carry the simple instructions that made his body his own. He would likely never recover full motor function. She said the word likely like a kindness. He understood she meant it as one. He did not say anything while the doctors were in the room. After they left, he looked at the ceiling for a long time and thought about the thing they had said, which was that the nerve pathways were blocked, which was that the signals from his brain could no longer complete the journey they had completed 10,000 times a day for 31 years. He thought about this the way he had thought about the defense schemes of opposing quarterbacks in college, not emotionally, or at least not only emotionally, but architecturally, trying to understand the actual structure of the problem so he could look at it from the right angle. The signals were blocked, not deleted, not destroyed, blocked. He filed that away and looked at the ceiling some more. He spent 2 months in intensive care. He developed pneumonia. He nearly died twice, once from the pneumonia, once from a secondary infection that decided to be ambitious. The nurses called him stubborn to his face and meant it as a compliment. His wife Soren came every day and sat beside him and held the hand that could not hold back and talked to him about ordinary things. The neighbors, the news, a recipe she'd found, a television program she thought he'd like. And he listened to her voice like a man listening to a radio signal from a civilization he no longer inhabited. He did not stop listening. She brought him a flask once tucked into a bag with a book and some magazines. A small silver flask with his initials on it, which she had given him for their second anniversary. She said she knew he couldn't use it, but she wanted him to have it. He had it on the bedside table for the full 2 months. When things were bad, and there were nights when things were very bad, when the machinery around him was doing the breathing, and the infection was winning whatever argument it was having with his immune system. He looked at the flask and thought about who he had been when she gave it to him, and decided that that person had not gone anywhere, that that person was the reason the machinery wasn't winning. The Vorth did not visit occupied zones. That was not their method. Their method was the field and the waiting. Deploy the suppression, wait for the affected human population to organize their care systems around their new limitations, and then arrive 16 months later with trade proposals and infrastructure partnership agreements and the studied benevolence of a civilization that had technically not fired a single shot. It was a very elegant strategy. Cale had to admit in the hospital ceiling that it was a very elegant strategy. It had worked on 7 other planets. He was 4 months into his recovery when the Vorth sent their first official communication to the human governments. It was warm in tone, regretful about the suffering that had accompanied first contact, confident that both civilizations could move forward together. It included a technical annex explaining that the suppression field would remain in place indefinitely as a precautionary security measure, but that affected individuals would be categorized as protected non-combatants under Vorth interstellar law and provided with basic care stipends. The stipends were, by Vorth standards, generous. By human standards, they were the distance between a life and a managed decline. Cale read the communication 3 times. He handed it to Soren. He looked at the ceiling. He said, "I need to find out if there is anything they don't know about us." The thing they did not know, the thing that did not exist in any of the 7 previous case files, was locomotor training. Dr. Amara Weiss had been working in the basement of a rehabilitation satellite clinic in Knoxville for 11 years before the field came down. And she had kept working in that same basement for the 2 years after, because basements are difficult to observe from geosynchronous orbit, and because her work required machines that were heavy enough to be inconvenient to move, and because she was not the kind of person who stopped doing a thing simply because the strategic context of the thing had become hostile. The principle was straightforward, even if the implementation was not. The human spinal cord, it turned out, was not simply a passive cable for carrying brain signals. It had its own intelligence, its own memory, its own capacity to learn. If you put a body through the motions of walking, even a body whose brain had been disconnected from its legs by scar tissue or field interference, the cord itself could begin to remember, could begin to reconstruct the patterns, could, given enough repetition and enough patience and enough stubborn refusal to accept the first answer, start to rebuild the roads that the Vorth had blocked. The roads were not deleted. They were blocked. He had filed that away in the hospital, and now here was the reason it mattered. The therapy was slow. It required machines and harnesses and treadmills, and hour after hour of a body doing what it could no longer feel itself doing. It required a particular quality of faith, not religious faith, not optimism exactly, but something more specific and more practical. The belief that doing the work was worth doing even when the results were invisible, because the invisibility was temporary and the work was permanent. Cale had driven 3,000 miles to find Amara Weiss. Soren had navigated. They had slept in adapted vehicles and eaten at whatever establishments had accessible entrances, and argued once, badly, in an Oklahoma parking lot at 11 at night about whether this was practical, or whether this was, as Soren had finally said, looking at her hands and not at him, just a way of refusing to be in the situation we are actually in. He had thought about that for a long time. He had said, "I know what situation we're in. I want to know if there's another one on the other side of it." She had looked at him. He had said, "I need to know if I tried everything, before I decide what everything means." They had driven the rest of the way in silence that wasn't angry. That was something else. The kind of silence that forms when 2 people have said the real thing and are now sitting with it. Doctor. We've met him at the clinic door in a facility that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and effort. She was smaller than he expected and had the eyes of someone who slept very little and had made peace with this. She looked at his chair, then at him, then back at the chair. She said, "What can you feel?" He said. "Not much," she said. "What can you move?" He demonstrated. She wrote something in her notebook for a long time. She wrote with the focused attention of someone who was not writing notes, but recording evidence. There was a quality to the way she looked at the information he was giving her, not as a problem to be solved, but as data that had not yet revealed its full significance. She was interested, not sympathetically interested, scientifically interested. He appreciated that more than she probably knew. Then she looked up and said something no one had said to him in 2 years. She said, "Okay, let's start." It took 11 months to regain partial sensation in his hands. It took another 8 to achieve what Weiss called functional grip. The grip was imprecise, asymmetrical, sufficient for certain tasks, and insufficient for others. And to KL, it felt like rediscovering a tool he had assumed was lost and finding that it was still a tool, just a different kind. He had to relearn everything: the angle of his wrists, the amount of force required, the patience necessary to button a shirt in 4 minutes when once it had taken 4 seconds. He learned it. All of it. He learned it with the same systematic stubbornness that had once made him the most effective defensive player in his conference, because stubbornness was a physical skill like any other, and physical skills were what he had. He also learned in this period that he was not alone in what he was doing. There were others like him, not in the clinical sense, not just other people with the same diagnosis, but people who had found the same crack in the wall and were pressing into it. People who had looked at the Voreth's elegant, bloodless suppression and decided that the elegance was the problem, that something which worked by making resistance seem unnecessary was the most dangerous weapon of all. Not because the resistance had to be dramatic, not because it required speeches or martyrs or grand gestures broadcast on every available channel, but because the Voreth were an old civilization that had done this many times and had very complete files on what human resistance looked like. And none of those files included a man doing leg press exercises in a harness rig in a basement in Knoxville at 6 in the morning, while his cord slowly remembered the shape of a step. We've documented everything, published nothing. The Voreth monitoring systems had flagged and suppressed 5 academic medical journals in the first year, but wrote everything down in longhand in notebooks that she kept in a waterproof case beneath a floor panel in the clinic's storage room. She had 12 full notebooks. She had found 11 other practitioners doing variations of the same work in basements and adapted garages and the back rooms of physical therapy offices where the front rooms had been retrofitted into Voreth-approved care facilities that distributed stipends and recommended acceptance. The network was not called anything yet. Cale named it Next Step. He named it after the thing we said at the beginning of every session. No matter where they were in the work, no matter how small the previous progress, or how discouraging the plateau, "Okay," she would say, "next step." Not as motivation, not as a speech, just as a statement of fact. The previous step was done. Now there was the next one. He liked that it didn't reach for anything. He liked that it assumed forward motion without making it the point. The network grew the way organisms grow in hostile environments, slowly, sideways, through gaps and adaptations rather than direct expansion. We trained 2 practitioners who trained 4 who trained 12, and each of them carried her notebooks and the principles and the specific quality of patients required to do work whose results were measured in weeks and months rather than sessions. They worked in 9 cities. They took no centralized records. They communicated through a system of modified agricultural scheduling software that the Voreth monitoring apparatus had not gotten around to restricting, because it primarily discussed soybean yields. Cale ran the logistics from his power chair, from a table in the back of a bakery in Manhattan Beach that Soren managed, on a laptop that Soren had configured with every accessibility adaptation that existed. He took calls. He drove to meetings in the chair's electric silence, the hum of its motors, a sound he had come to associate with agency rather than limitation. He had stopped thinking of the chair as the thing he was stuck in. He had started thinking of it as the thing he moved with. This was not a small distinction. In the 3rd year, the Voreth noticed Next Step. They didn't shut it down. That wasn't their method. Their method was the elegant approach, a series of regulatory advisories classifying unlicensed neurological intervention as a violation of protected non-combatant status under interstellar law. a travel restriction on certain categories of medical equipment, a revised care stipend structure that made continued participation in independent rehabilitation financially non-viable for most participants. It was a very clean operation, bloodless. The kind of thing that, when you tried to describe it to someone who hadn't been paying attention, sounded almost reasonable. 3 next step locations closed in 4 months. The 4th location held because Torres in Albuquerque had anticipated the financial restructuring and had already converted the center to a nonprofit cooperative with independent funding. The 5th held because a retired federal judge in Portland had spent 3 months building a legal argument that the Vorith regulatory advisories were unenforceable under pre-existing domestic law, and had filed that argument in a federal court that was still technically in session. The others held because their operators had looked at the closures and decided, individually and without coordination, that they would rather operate illegally than stop operating at all. Cale sat at his table in the bakery and looked at the numbers. Soren set a cup of coffee beside his keyboard. She knew he would not pick it up, but she always set it there, a gesture that meant, "I see you working." And she said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "Something they can't regulate." He said it slowly, the way he said things when he was thinking while talking rather than after. He said, "They can restrict equipment, and they can restrict funding, and they can restrict buildings. What they can't restrict is motion. What they can't restrict is someone moving from one place to another, in public, on a road, for as long as it takes." Soren looked at him. He said, "I want to ride from Los Angeles to D.C." He said, "In the chair." He said, 3,000 miles. There was a long pause. Soren said, 3,000 miles on what roads? He said, the good ones and the bad ones. All of them. She said, "And the point is?" He said, "The point is every town we go through sees us. And when they see us, they talk about us. And when they talk about us, they talk about what we're doing and why. And the Vorith can shut down a clinic, but they can't shut down every conversation, in every diner, and every gas station, and every veterans hall, in every medium-sized American city between the Pacific and the Potomac." Soren was quiet for a moment. She said, "Your chair maxes out at 8 miles an hour." He said, "I know." She said, "That's a long time on a road." He said, "I know." She said, "I'll meet you in 4 cities." He called Anderson Bell that night. Bell had been his roommate at Georgetown. A tall, frenetic, unreasonably optimistic man who had once talked Cale into a 7-mile trail run at 4 in the morning on the grounds that dawn looked better from higher elevation. Bell said yes before Cale had finished the sentence. He said it the way he said everything, with the slightly alarming velocity of a person who had been waiting for someone to ask. Bell said, "I'll ride my bike the whole way." Cale said, "The whole way." Bell said, "What am I doing otherwise?" Nick Goddard, who had a van and filming equipment and a South African accent and the specific quality of calm that people develop when they have spent years documenting things that are difficult to document, said he would drive the supply vehicle. He said this as though the conversation were already over and they were already on the road, which Cale liked about him. They left Manhattan Beach on a Tuesday morning in March. A dozen people were there at the start. Next step participants, neighbors, 2 former teammates who had gotten word and driven down the night before. No ceremony. Bell's bike was loaded. The van was running. Cale adjusted his chair's settings one final time the way he always did. A small ritual that had nothing to do with the settings. And then he moved forward, and the road received him. The first day was 43 miles. Cale had rehearsed the distance mathematically, understood it as a number, and then discovered that numbers and roads are different things. The roads through the eastern stretches of Los Angeles County were not built with the assumption that anyone would be traveling them at 8 miles an hour in a power chair for the better part of a day. There were curb cuts that were not quite curb cuts. There were shoulders that became no shoulders. There was an overpass outside Pomona where the sun came at a specific angle that made the entire road surface disappear into white glare. And Cale navigated it by feel and by memory of the map and by not stopping. Bell rode beside him on stretches where the road allowed it. On stretches where it didn't, he rode ahead and waited, or fell back and followed, and he talked. Not constantly, not in the performed cheerfulness way of someone trying to maintain morale, but conversationally, the way they had talked since they were 20 years old, about nothing and about everything. Baseball. A book Bell had been reading about territorial expansion, whether the best sandwiches were a regional phenomenon or a universal principle. Once, on a long flat stretch at outside Riverside, Bell told a story about his grandmother that Cale had never heard before, And the story was funny, and then sad, and then somehow funny again, and they were both quiet for a while after, and then Belle said, "It's a nice sky today," and Cale looked up at the sky and agreed. The towns received them the way small communities receive unexpected things, with suspicion first, then curiosity, then the particular warmth that opens up when people understand that something real is happening in front of them. In Albuquerque, a woman named Torres, who ran a veterans support center, met them at the city limit and brought them to a parking lot where 40 people were waiting. Some of them were in chairs. Some were on crutches. Some were ambulatory, but moved with the deliberate care of people who had learned that the body's cooperation is not guaranteed. Torres had found out about Next Step through the soybean scheduling network. She had laughed when she said this, a short practical laugh that contained no embarrassment, and she had been running a locomotor training program in her center's back room for 7 months. She took Cale through it. The harness apparatus was improvised from industrial rigging equipment, and a treadmill she'd bought secondhand from a hotel that was liquidating its fitness center. The documentation was meticulous. The results were documented with the same careful handwriting as Weis's notebooks, the same precise measurements, the same absence of anything that could be called false hope, because the results themselves were the hope and they did not need embellishment. Torres said, "I've been waiting to show someone this." Cale looked at the room. He looked at the rigging. He looked at a man about his own age doing the slow, assisted walking practice with the focused expression of someone learning something the hard way and not minding. The man's hands were on the support bars. His legs moved in the practiced repetition of locomotor training, the cord remembering, the pathways slowly reconstructing themselves, the roads being rebuilt from the inside. He said, "How many people know about this?" She said, "Not enough." In Amarillo, 3 of his former Georgetown teammates rode out to meet them at the city boundary and joined for the day's stretch. 3 large men on bicycles, calling to each other and to Cale and to strangers on the sidewalk, with the specific cheerful aggression of men who had spent years learning to use their bodies as instruments and had never quite turned that off. One of them, a defensive end named Reyes, had a son with a spinal cord injury from the field suppression. He had traveled from Houston for the day's ride. He didn't say much. He pulled up beside Cale on a quieter stretch of road and rode with him for a mile without speaking, and then said, "My son watched you leave from the TV. He said, tell him Next Step." Cale looked at the road ahead. He said, "I'll tell him in person when we get back." At a diner outside Amarillo, a Vorith administrator, one of the ground-level liaison officers, the Vorith, stationed in human communities in the 2nd year, bland and polite in their human-tailored clothes, sat 3 tables away and watched them. Made no move to approach, just watched. Made notes in the administrator's small rectangular notepad, the same style they all carried, which Cale had always found interesting. The Vorith were, by all accounts, an advanced civilization with sophisticated recording technology. They still took notes by hand. He didn't know what to make of that. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just a habit they hadn't thought to change. Belle looked at the administrator, looked at Cale. Cale said, "Let them watch." Belle said, "You sure?" Cale said, "They're watching because they're trying to figure out what category this goes in, what regulation applies. They're looking for the lever." He picked up his coffee cup with the functional grip that had taken 11 months to recover and drank from it. He said, "There's no lever." The Vorith filed 3 regulatory advisories over the course of the journey. The first flagged the route as an unauthorized mobile medical operation and requested that it cease. Cale's legal advisor responded that the journey was a civic exercise and a fundraising event, and that no medical procedures were being conducted on any road in any state. The second advisory reclassified the ride as a coordinated information dissemination event in violation of Vorith Communications guidelines for occupied territories. The response noted that a private citizen in a power chair talking to people he met on a public road did not constitute a communications operation under any definition that had ever existed in human law. The third advisory flagged the soybean scheduling network as a potential security concern. The soybean farmers responded with 17 pages of documentation about actual soybean scheduling, including yield projections for the next 3 quarters and a detailed breakdown of weather patterns in the affected regions. The Vorith did not file a 4th advisory. The road got hard in West Virginia. The Appalachians were not interested in accommodating anyone. The grades were steep and long, and the road surfaces were ancient and patched and repatched in different materials at different times, so the whole thing had the texture of a document with too many editors. The chair's motors climbed what they could in Cale's arms. The functional grip, the relearned angles, the rebuilt pathways, worked the manual override on grades where the motors needed help, and there were days where they made 20 miles instead of 60 and camped in state park parking lots with Nick Van running for heat and Bell doing stretches in the headlights like a man who had simply decided that physical discomfort was not an argument. Soren joined them in Charleston. She had driven from Louisville, where she'd spent 3 days with 3 Next Step practitioners who needed supply deliveries and operational consultation. Notebooks, equipment components that had been rerouted through the agricultural network because direct shipping had been flagged, and a specific piece of harness rigging that Weiss had designed and that 3 clinics urgently needed. She arrived at the parking lot where they'd stopped for the evening and got out of her car and walked to Cale's chair and stood there for a moment looking at him in the last light. Road-weathered, thinner than when he'd left, his hands on the chair's arms with the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision and is no longer spending energy second-guessing it. She said, "You look like hell." He said, "I feel like I'm almost there." She said, 28 days and 400 miles. He said, "That's almost there." She put her hand on his shoulder. He turned his head and put his cheek against the back of her hand, and they stayed like that for a moment in the parking lot with the highway noise in the background and the van engine ticking as it cooled. Bell was somewhere inside the van pretending very obviously not to be watching. Nick was filming and making no pretense of not doing so. Soren said quietly, "I know why you had to do this. I knew before you did." He said, "I know you did." She said, "I just wanted you to know that I knew." He said, "I know." They stayed like that another moment. Bell called from the van that dinner was ready and they went. The last day was 80 miles. They had planned for 60, but the final stretch cooperated. Flat roads, good surfaces, a tailwind that Bell insisted was a moral phenomenon rather than a meteorological one. The news that they were coming had spread through the communications networks, the community boards, the word-of-mouth chains that run through any connected population that has learned to communicate through unofficial channels. People lined the road outside Frederick, Maryland, outside Rockville. A woman flagged them down at a gas station outside Gaithersburg to hand Cale a letter from her daughter, who was 14 and who had been in locomotor training for 6 months, and who had written, in careful handwriting, that she had taken 8 steps without the support bars on Wednesday. He put the letter in his jacket pocket. On the long, straight approach to Georgetown's campus, where the brick buildings stood in the spring morning light, and the cherry trees were at full expression, there were more people than he had expected. Far more. There were Next Step participants in chairs and on crutches. There were practitioners from 11 cities who had driven or flown in overnight. There were Georgetown teammates and former colleagues and strangers who had heard about the ride and driven from 3 states to be present for the end of it. There were veterans from the Vets First chapters and families that Torres had called from Albuquerque and Reyes standing near the front with his son, who was seated in a chair and wearing a Georgetown sweatshirt and watching the approach with an expression that was trying not to be hope and not quite succeeding. And there were Voreth, 4 of them in their liaison suits, standing at the edge of the crowd with their notepads, watching, trying to determine what category this belonged to. It didn't belong to any category. That was the point. The administrator for Murillo was there, he thought, or one exactly like them, standing slightly apart from the other 3 with the specific posture of someone who has been reporting on a subject for long enough to have developed a grudging interest in it. He watched them watching the crowd and thought about what was in their notes, wondered if they had a word for it, what it looked like in their filing system. He hoped it gave whoever read the files a headache. KL saw the balloon arch from 200 meters, red and white and blue, stretched between the old stone gates of Georgetown University, and the crowd standing under it, and on both sides of it, and along the road leading to it. Bell was beside him now, off the bike and walking it, no longer talking. Nick had come around from the van and was filming from ahead, walking backward, his face behind the camera that never wavered. The road was clean and flat, and the chair's motors ran at their full, quiet hum. The sound Cale had come to know the way a sailor knows the sound of a hull, every frequency of it, what normal sounded like, what strain sounded like. what the sound of something working properly felt like in your chest. He thought about the water, how calm it had looked, how much he had trusted it, how a door had closed, and all the lights had gone out on a room he had lived in for 31 years. He had stopped being angry about the water a long time ago. Not because it didn't deserve anger, but because anger is a fuel that burns fast and the road is long. What he had left was something quieter and more durable. The knowledge that the first answer is not always the final answer. That the doctors who say there is no hope are not lying. They are reporting what the evidence suggests, and the evidence is real, and sometimes the evidence is wrong. That the body has capacities that are invisible until they are tested. That the people who choose to be beside you in the worst stretches of road are choosing something that costs them, and that cost is a form of love that doesn't require a name. That a human being moving through the world, slowly, imperfectly, in a machine that hums in your sternum, with your friends keeping pace, is doing something that cannot be fully categorized, fully suppressed, or fully understood by any civilization that has not spent its evolutionary history learning to refuse. To refuse the clean prognosis, to refuse the stipend, to refuse the elegant, bloodless certainty of a species that has done this 7 times before and has very detailed records on exactly how it ends. The records were wrong. He raised his fist at the balloon arch, not dramatically, not as a performance, just a fist, lifted, the functional grip that had taken 11 months to recover, held up in the morning air in front of the people who had gathered to see it. His hand was not perfectly steady. The grip was imprecise and asymmetrical, the way it always was. None of that mattered. The fist was up. That was the point of it. Not the fist itself, but the fact that it had taken 2 years to get there, and 11 months to get the hand back, and 3,000 miles on every kind of road. And here it was anyway. Race's son raised his own fist from the chair, and then other arms going up, along the route, along the sides of the road. A wave of raised hands moving back through the crowd like a shock wave running backward, which was, Kale thought, exactly what it was. He drove through the arch. The Voreth filed no advisories about what happened at the gates of Georgetown University on the 28th day of April. They stood at the edge of the crowd with their notepads and their observer's stillness, and they watched a man in a power chair raise his fist and drive through a balloon arch, and the notebooks stayed closed. Whatever they were waiting to write down, this was not something they had a word for. They would need to invent one. He had a suggestion, but he suspected the translation wouldn't carry. Soren walked beside him through the gates, and she was crying in the contained way she cried, with her jaw set and her eyes bright, and one hand pressed flat against her sternum. He reached sideways and found her hand with the functional grip that wasn't quite a grip, but was close enough. And she held on, and they went forward together, and the crowd closed around them like a wave, and this time the wave was something you could trust. Behind them on the road, Bell finally let himself make a sound. It wasn't a word. It didn't need to be. Somewhere in the crowd, a 14-year-old girl from Gaithersburg was counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.